gives me great pleasure to introduce Amy Dickman, who is a professor of wildlife conservation at Oxford University and director of the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit here, and she's a Kaplan Senior Research Fellow. And she's over 25 years experience of working on large carnivores and human carnivore conflict in Africa. And she has a master's from Oxford and did her PhD at University College London.
Cool.
Over to you, Amy.
Thanks, Yavinda. Yes, thank you everyone for coming and for giving up some of your Friday afternoon. It's a daring slot to have a seminar series on. Yeah, and wonderful to be back here. I actually did my master's here at BCM, I think in the first or the second year. So it's always great to be back at the school here and seeing the course still going. As I said to a couple of people, this is going to be a very applied talk. So I talk very much about our applied conservation work. So I run the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit. We're very much focused on science for impact and trying to look at how you can bridge that gap between the understanding and the scientific underpinning of these things and then doing practical conservation action. So there's ecological work that we do in this project and others, but I'm going to focus today mainly on the conservation work. So I'm going to see if this works for a second. Let me just click on it. It's often you've got to click on it, haven't you? Cool. So I'm going to focus particularly on big cats, not just because they're pretty, but because they have really immense value in multiple different ways.
Carry on talking.
Yep. So big cats have always been valued in human culture. For as long as we have existed, big cats have really been seminal to us. So this painting on the right here, this sculpture, sorry, was found in Germany. It was carved about 40,000 years ago. It was carved from woolly mammoth ivory, and it's meant to be the first figurative art that has been discovered by people. So as soon as people started carving forms of themselves, this one actually has the body of a man and the head of a lion. So right from the dawn of culture, people were really representing wildlife and particularly big cats as a really intertwined role with people. And similarly, if you go to the Chauvet caves in France, you'll see all these depictions, extensive depictions in cave art of lions performing all the same behaviours they would perform if you saw them in the Serengeti today, with the notable exception that the males don't have manes. But it really highlights again how important and how deeply in our psyche and humanity big cats have always played a really important role. And they're used extensively to inspire people even today in multiple different ways. So if you look around, it's one of the things I do if I'm bored in an airport or somewhere. I'll be thinking, well, how long would it take before I can see a lion? And genuinely, it's always within like 5 to 10 minutes. You can find one on something. Because they're on everything from sports teams to luxury goods logos, national flags, all over the place. So they're really extensively depicted. And this has gone from, as I say, tens of thousands of years ago. This iconography has been maintained through the millennia to the present day, all the way down to things like the door knocker on 10 Downing Street is in the form of a lion. And that value is not just hypothetical and just cultural. They have multiple different values in very real ways today as well. So they obviously have ecological value. So this is something we often talk about as biologists, obviously the need to maintain top carnivores and the fact that if you are maintaining top carnivores, by definition, you're also maintaining sufficient prey and sufficient habitat to ensure that you've got that viable population left. So they can be good flagship and umbrella species for conservation. They also have really important economic value to the countries in which they occur. So things like phototourism and trophy hunting, something I'm going to come on to a little bit later in the discussion because it's just an interesting thing to start thinking about. But all of these activities really give very tangible values to the countries that still maintain large carnivores. And there's also really important existence value. So even if you're never lucky enough to see a lion or a tiger or a snow leopard out in the wild, I think there is something so fantastic about knowing that we live in a world that has Uber and Deliveroo and ChatGPT and all of this kind of stuff, but still is wild enough to maintain these predators in really wild places of the world that are still out there performing those natural functions. So for me, to take a little bit of a step back, I've always been fascinated on a personal level by these animals in that way that so many of us are across the world for no particular reason. I grew up in Devon, so the biggest thing that we had was an antagonistic moggy that used to attack you as you went down the stairs, but was always passionate, particularly and for no particular reason, about lions. And in fact, my brother and I dug up a memory box that we had buried when I was 10 and he was 12. And in it, we had written what we wanted to be doing at the then unimaginable age of 30. And I wasn't very ambitious, clearly. I only had 2 things written on my list. I said I wanted to be studying lions in the Serengeti, and I wanted to have a zebra-striped Land Rover was the other thing I wanted. Actually, I happened to spend my 30th birthday in the Serengeti watching lions. Just by pure happenstance, I was in the Serengeti that day, but I remember toasting with this bottle of champagne and looking at this lion and thinking, how random that this actually happened. At the end of the day, I still don't have, and we have multiple broken down Land Rovers in the field, and I keep meaning to paint one zebra stripe just to tick it off the bucket list, because, you know, I think my 10-year-old self would be pretty happy. But beyond those sort of vague aspirations of being around lions and zebra-striped Land Rovers, obviously as things went on, I was like, how actually do you move from that kind of passion for big cats towards doing something about it and building a career about it? And I did my undergraduate degree in zoology, and even there everyone kept saying, what do you want to do? And I'd say, I want to work on big cats. They'd say, but what's your plan B? I'm like, hang on, what happened to plan A? Why did we skip straight past it? They're like, well, no one works on big cats. So I was like, someone must work on big cats. And eventually looking around, particularly during my degree, the real dream was to join Wild Crew, because I found out about it. I was super impressed by David McDonald. I'd seen his Velvet Claw series. I'd read the books about it. And it really seemed to me that as soon as you joined Wild Crew, if you were lucky enough to join, you got assigned a big cat species. So we've got like David and Andy with a lion. It's not dead. No lions were hurt in the making of this. David with Chewbacca the cheetah. There's Andy and a clouded leopard, Arjun and a tiger. So I was like, this is the place that I really want to be. So I ended up, very luckily, I had no idea what to do at the end of my undergraduate, happened to pick up a New Scientist, and at the back of it there was an advert for people to join Wild Crew as volunteers for 6 months. So I was like, oh my God, this is the dream. Came up to Oxford, did a terrifying interview with David where I accidentally mistook or confused corvids with cervids and spent a painful few minutes talking about how impressive antlers were on corvids. But despite that, somehow they saw through that, or just had a really shallow pool of people to pick from. And they said, fair enough, you can come up and join. So I went to join and went to meet David for the first day at Wild Crew. And I was like, what is my big cat species going to be? I'm here, I'm ready to make these childhood dreams come true. And David said, I've got the perfect study species for you. You need to work on the water shrew. The water shrew. And I was like, I mean, it's big for a shrew, but it's about 15,000 times smaller than a lion. So I was a bit like, okay, everyone's got to do their dues. You know, I'm going to work on the water shrew. I say work on it. I walked up and down endless, like, you know, canals and rivers in Oxfordshire and around the back, looking for this thing. I don't actually believe it exists in the UK. I think it was a total hazing exercise. But after dutifully looking through numerous empty traps, David said, okay, fair enough, you know, I think it's time to do a PhD. We've got the perfect PhD subject for you. You're definitely cut out to work on water voles. And I was like, it's just, that is rubbish as an animal. Sorry, they're cute. Don't tell Tom. But yeah, it's not a lion. So I was like, no, I really, really want to work on big cats. So I turned down the water vole PhD and said, I really want to work on carnivores. And eventually the whining paid off a bit, because then David said, well, you can do some work on badgers. And I was like, God, it's getting bigger. Like, this thing actually has teeth. But, you know, obviously water voles have teeth. I know that, but, you know, not like, not like proper teeth. And, anyway, so it finally got towards carnivores, and then I thought, well, this isn't really going quite where I want it to be. I'd been in Wild Crew for about a year, and then went and looked at an advert to join Cambridge to join their meerkat project. I thought, well, it's not actually cats. I mean, it's right there in the word. I figured that, especially with some Americans, you could probably get away with telling them they were cats, but I figured at least it's African experience. So I went and got offered a place to join the meerkat project, and came back and told David that I was going to go and do that. And you know what it's like, Oxford, Cambridge, they're never a fan of losing them to Cambridge, if anywhere. And David said, no, no, no. We've got this woman who's working here, and it'd be really good if you could join her to help with her PhD. And she's working out in Namibia on cheetahs. Would you like to go and work in Namibia on cheetahs? I was like, yes, I would. And so I headed out to Namibia, was meant to be a 6-month placement out there, and stayed out there for 6 years and worked on all sorts of aspects of cheetah and leopard conservation and ecology, but particularly looking at conflict between cheetahs and local people. And during that time in Namibia, I mean, intensity of the conflict here with cheetahs was really sky high. So on the game farms, they were removing sort of about 27 cheetahs, I think, on a game farm per year, about 14 cheetahs per year from a livestock farm. So we were dealing with hundreds of these cats coming through, looking at places to release them. It was a fantastic time. But one of the things that really stayed with me during that time, in addition to learning about cheetahs, was how Laurie dealt, particularly with the farmers. And these farmers would often do awful things to these cheetahs. We would have cheetahs that would come in and have been tortured in trap cages, have had things like, you know, hot metal poked into their eyes, really terrible things. They would often kill the adults. They would then feel bad and bring in the cubs to us. And that's obviously pointless because you can't do anything, you know, release a cow, then you have to captive rear. Anyway, so I said, but she was always endlessly engaging with the farmers, very much talking to them about what they needed from conservation. I said to her, how on earth can you do this? You know, these people are really a nightmare and are causing all these harms to cheetahs. And she said, it's, you know, it's the only way. They are not doing it because they're bad people. They're people who are doing it because there are pressures on them. And you've got to think about it from their perspective. These cats are causing massive issues for them. You've got to think about it from the farmer's side of it, and demonizing them doesn't do any good. You've got to try and find that common ground to move forward if we want to build, you know, long-standing conservation together. And it's something that I always think she's been amazing at, something that very much has shaped, I think, the way that I now look at how to approach conservation out in the field where I work. So after working there for 6 years, I sort of felt like I was getting a little bit out of touch with the science side of it. We were writing papers, but I was thinking, now that I know more, that I'm interested in conflict, I want to go back and get more training in sort of the academic side, just to give me more of a foundation for the next stage of my career. So I came back here, I did the master's here at the Biodiversity Conservation Management one, and then went and did the PhD at ZSL and UCL, looking at the determinants of human-wildlife conflict in Tanzania. And so I was working down in the Ruaha landscape. This is a very remote patch of southern Tanzania. This is the Great Ruaha River here. It was something that, you know, I'd been up to Serengeti. I was working a bit with Sarah Durant, who works up there, a spectacular location, really fantastic. And she said, well, do you want to do a PhD with me? And I was like, absolutely. So I sort of signed on the dotted line. And then she said, there are way too many people in Serengeti. We need you to work in Ruaha. And I was like, where? I'd never even heard of it. She said, just drive like 16 hours south and you'll find it. And I was like, okay. So I took this ancient Land Rover and drove down south, hit literally this spot. And I was like, all right. It took way more than 17 hours, by the way. It involved getting saved by Catholic nuns on the way. It was a disaster. The car broke down. It's total chaos. But having arrived here, there was a little WCS field camp that was based there. And the very first night that I spent in Ruaha, a huge male lion came along and slept on that tent, completely crushing me. The story is on National Geographic. There's a whole thing about it. But it was the most terrifying experience of my life. I was lying there. The only thing I had to defend myself with was a Leatherman and a deodorant. So I'd worked out some cunning way of killing this lion if it came in, using these two. But while lying there, crushed by this 30-stone cat, I remember thinking, God, like, if there is ever a place to look at conflict, this is it. Because, you know, these animals are really up close and personal around people. And so when I was there, I mean, I was lucky enough, of course, to I had the Leatherman, I had the deodorant, I had access to vehicles and things, but conflict was a major issue for people in this area. So they obviously caused massive impact on local people, and people then responded by killing lions and other large carnivores in large numbers. Now, for my master's and my PhD, we would talk to people and we would say to them, are you killing many lions? And they would say, no, they cause lots of problems, but we don't kill them. And I was thinking, I don't believe you. Because if I was you, suffering the sort of cost that you suffer, I would be killing them. And I just think you're probably not being particularly honest about the reasons for this. And this is a lion that we found out in the bush. It has a snare wound here. The scalp's been taken. Later on, we discovered this is a symbol of a hey killing. So a particular tribe called the hey. They take skin from the top of it to show that you've killed the lion. And so you take this strip and you can go and prove this kill to other people and get rewards for it. I sort of said to them, well, why don't you take all of the skin and then cut it into the parts? And then you could pretend you'd killed 6 lions or something. And they said, no, if you do that, you go mentally ill. You've got to just take this one strip of fur from the top of the head. So fine. So there's a lot of it, and I'll come on to it later, a lot of the cultural aspects around lion killing turned out to be a very big deal. And so we were getting a snapshot into the lion killing, but through the master and the PhD, as I said, we were sort of getting hints of it, but in general, most people said they didn't kill them. And these animals do cause major issues, and despite all the values that I talked about earlier, this kind of conflict really means that species like lions are in serious trouble. So if you look at the, the range-wide maps of lions, this is obviously entirely made up. So I like to show any sort of made-up statistics. 1890, they're totally guessing at maybe 200,000 lions and an extensive range through Africa. By 1970, the guesstimate was probably somewhere around 75,000 lions, but still relatively contiguous range with these big sort of centres of populations in East Africa and Southern Africa. And by 2020, the estimate is somewhere around 25,000 lions, and still a reasonable sort of contiguous habitat for some of these big populations. But as you can see in West and North and Central Africa, really heavily fragmented. And the things that are driving lion decline are the same for many other large carnivores and many other species. So for them, human-wildlife conflict, the loss of habitat, and the loss of wild prey. So this on the right-hand side, for instance, this is Maswa Game Reserve in Tanzania. This is an area used for trophy hunting. This on the left is farmland. There's no fence or anything here. It's just the fact that this is a place where wildlife is obviously the form of economic revenue, and this is where wildlife costs people revenue. So obviously, people clear the land and choose other land uses. And many of the remaining populations are very fragile. So this is an analysis we did not long ago, looking at the geopolitical fragility of different lion populations. So these blue ones, the only big lion populations left. There are only 6 populations left that have at least 1,000 lions in them. And nearly half the remaining lion populations have fewer than 50 lions left in them. So there are about 67 wild lion populations in total, but actually there are very few that are likely to be viable in the long term. And as many of you will have experienced with other species, it leaves you with some really complex dilemmas about where do you put your time and your effort? Do you spend your time, working on the last 30 lions up in sort of, maybe in one of the populations in West and Central Africa, or do you focus on these big 6 and hope that, if you focus there, then in 50 years, we won't turn around and find that they all look like they've got, 10 or 20 lions left in them. So there's no right answer to that, but we've just done a big analysis looking at the different forms of pressure on each of these populations so that it can hopefully help decision makers think about where they want to put their investments and what the challenges will be. So Elaine and I, after our PhDs, Elaine Cotterill here also did her PhD at Oxford, and she and I jointly set up a project called Lion Landscapes. So this is linked with Wild Crew, and it's a classic kind of Wild Crew project where we're, as I said, linking science but with real conservation action. So we are working in 4 different landscapes across Africa. Most of my work has been here in Runguruaha in southern Tanzania. We're also working in Salunieri, so the biggest lion population left, somewhere about 4,000 lions. We're working in Laikipia in central Kenya. And we're also working in the Luangwa Valley, which is a really important area of connectivity between 2 big national parks. So while I'm talking about lions a lot and while our project has the word lions in it, lions are really just an umbrella species for much more. So under that umbrella, we are focusing on multiple different species. We focus on large carnivores, so spotted hyenas, leopards, cheetahs, and African wild dogs. And the way that we do that is we try to stop the main threats that are occurring to large carnivores. We try to reduce the local costs of living with those carnivores. We look at delivering meaningful local benefits from conservation. That's super important, and I'll get onto that a bit more later. And really importantly, we enable community ownership of conservation activities. And all of that requires a healthy habitat, healthy prey populations, and really depends on properly engaging local people as shareholders, not just stakeholders in these projects. And these people are often extremely poor. So in most of the lion landscape sites, most people are living on less than $1 a day. So things like food insecurity is a major concern. So most people aren't able, for example, to give their children 2 meals a day. And there's very little access to clean water or improved sanitation. So diseases like cholera and giardia are endemic. Obviously, things like COVID were a major issue. And combined with that, there's very little or no access to improved forms of medical care, particularly sort of Western medical care. And so the life expectancy is very low. And there's also high levels of illiteracy, particularly for women. So for women in our sort of vocal areas in southern Tanzania, about 75% of the household heads are illiterate. So it really means that people get trapped into poverty and they have very few future options just because they can't break out of this cycle without some of those basic skills, and everyone's so pressured by those existing sort of poverty-related pressures upon them. And then you've got the additional pressures that come with living by some of the largest large carnivore populations left on the planet. And so this man, for instance, he had this cow that had been saving for their son's circumcision ceremony For the Barabeg, I'll talk more about them later, but there are certain colours of cattle that are really important. This was a black cow with a white head, really important culturally, saved for the circumcision ceremony. Then it got killed by a lion. He then went and poisoned the cow carcass, and 3 lions were killed. So this is damaging, obviously, for him, his family. It's damaging for the cattle and the livestock, and it's also obviously damaging for the carnivores and the retaliation. And this turned out to be a huge issue. So when we set up the project, I started working after my PhD down in Ruaha, thinking, okay, we're getting told this stuff and we just go in and out for our field work, but what is it like when you actually live on the ground there amongst some of these villages and see if whether the amount of lion killing and carnivore killing is actually as low as they say, or whether it's really much higher. And so we set up a camp, a little tented camp down in southern Tanzania, and we found very quickly that the killing was sky high, way higher than we had anticipated. So these are just a few images from 2011 when we just set up that field site. And these were literally ones that you would come across in the bush. You would walk through, you'd smell something rotting, you'd go and look, and you'd find carcasses of all kinds of animals, but large carnivores in particular. We found 27 lions killed just around this tiny little village, the one village of about 500 households that we were working in primarily. So the killing was actually the highest recorded rate of lion killing anywhere in East Africa. Lots of poisonings. In addition to the sheer numbers of lions being killed, 2 things really jumped out at us. The first was that a lot of the animals were missing their right front paw. So we had no idea why. We would just come across these carcasses. Often it was the only thing missing on the carcass was this right paw. And then the second thing that jumped out at us was that they were often, especially the poison animals, were often heavily pregnant females. So as we all know, taking out adult females is the quickest way to drive a population down, and you would often come across a carcass where you would cut them open and there'd be 3 or 4 cubs ready to be born. So devastating for the population. And it was clear that this level of impact was likely to be very, very unsustainable. And something I'm going to talk about later is more about the trophy hunting issues, but I was going between Tanzania and the UK and finding all this fuss in the UK about trophy hunting and pushing about this is sort of driving lion decline. The amount of lion killing that we found around Ruaha was about 50 to 100 times higher than would be permitted if it was a trophy hunting area, and was getting almost no attention because it's complicated and it's difficult and there's no bad guy. You can't like blame these people who are kissing behind a lion, and there's no evil villain to look at it into it. But it was, in reality, it's extremely devastating. So this was an event we went to where we had a mortality alert from one of our collared lions. And when we turned up there, there wasn't just 1 dead lion, there were 6 dead lions. And there were 75 critically endangered vultures. And so this kind of impact has huge knock-on impacts, not just for carnivores, but for scavengers and for many other species. When we talked to people about why this was happening, everyone said you have to talk to the Barabeg. The Barabeg are the ones doing a lot of the killing. And so the Barabeg are a pastoralist tribe. They are very similar to the Maasai, but if you look up the Barabeg, you find very little about them. They're a sister tribe. They wear black instead of red, but they're extremely secretive and hostile about conservation in particular, for lots of good reasons. But people said to us they just will not engage with outsiders in general. There's a lot of killing between Barabeg and rival groups, and they won't engage, particularly with Westerners, and they certainly won't engage with conservationists. And we thought, oh, I'm sure it'll be fine, we'll figure it out, it'll be good. So we set up our little field camp and said we worked in a Barabeg area for 2 years, and we had funds to go and try and sort of engage people and do community conservation. And we tried everything. People would run away from us, people would disappear. You'd go to a household and, and there'd be a goat wandering around and clearly sort of food on the fire, and but people would just run off rather than be with you. So it was really frustrating. And about 2 years in, I was thinking, my God, we literally cannot work with these people. There's no way of engaging if no one will ever talk to us. And then we happened to put up solar panels at camp to charge our laptops. And suddenly the Barabeg turned up to charge their mobile phones. And to this day, I kick myself that we didn't think of this beforehand. And again, one of those things, rather than trying to talk to them about what you want, talk to them and offer something that they want, which in this case was a charging station. People were having to walk 20 kilometers to charge their mobile phones. Their mobile phones were as important to them as they are to any of us. They charge they check Facebook, they share information about livestock prices if children have gone missing in the bush, etc. All sorts of things, sharing little funny memes on WhatsApp, all the normal kinds of stuff. And we had suddenly offered them this charging station in the bush. So people they would come to the camp. It wasn't sort of a breakthrough moment, But they would stay around and wait for their phones to be charged and just watch us, and a little bit of the hostility would sort of decrease over time. And eventually, we managed to get the young warriors to agree to come to camp and to hear a little bit about what we actually did. And we talked to them, we said, we are not the Wildlife Division, we are not the police, we are not the Parks Authority. All we're trying to do is understand why you're killing quite this many lions, and is there a way that you can get what you're getting, but in a way that doesn't maybe kill quite that many. You know, we're not saying it's not within our remit to say you can't kill the lions, but just help us understand what's happening. And they said, yeah, sure, we understand, really interested. It was a fantastic meeting. They brought lots of banana beer, which always helps lubricate any meeting. It is horrendous, but it really does help meetings go with a bang. And so everyone left this meeting super happy, and I was like, finally, you know, 2.5 years in, we're finally going to get to work with the Barabeg. Within a week, that same group of young men went out and killed 7 lions right around our camp. And this was just the lowest point of the project by far. Like, you know, all of the team was in tears. They were just like, it's just not worth it. And I remember thinking, God, we've tried, we've literally tried, and we've just thrown everything back in our faces, and we cannot work with them. I called up Leela Hazar, who runs Lion Guardians, a friend of mine, and I said to her, I just can't do it anymore. We've tried everything. They just don't want to work with us. And she said, this is a test. She said, they know you care about lions. They said, you've just told them at this meeting that you care about the community. So now they're directly making you choose, when push comes to shove, who do you choose? Do you choose the lions and go to the authorities, or do you choose the community relationships and stick with them and don't kind of shop them? And I thought, God, it was so useful to have someone to be able to talk to about that, because I would have probably failed that test. And so he said, you've got to do nothing. We did nothing. We measured the lion carcasses. They knew, we knew. And about a week after that, they came and they said, now we want you to come down to our traditional meeting in the bush. And the first time they'd ever had outsiders at the Barabeg meetings there, and certainly Westerners, and they said, now we will talk to you about why we're killing lions. And it was a really, really great just start of something. Obviously, lots of ups and downs over the last sort of decade since, but still, that foundation of a community trust was laid. And obviously, as we know, that's fundamental for every relationship. So when they talked about why they were killing lions, the obvious thing was attacks on livestock. That's the main driver of conflict. And so a big part of what we do in the project is trying to understand and to reduce depredation risk. So we collar lions, we look at the tracks of where they go, and through that we map out sort of conflict risk spots for where depredations are most likely to occur. So we can use that to actually target mitigation efforts. We also set up something called Collaring for Coexistence, and this is trying to ensure that local people, it's not just scientists getting access to the data, local people can have access to the data as well. So we said, rather than people not knowing where lions are, if we collar the lions, let's make sure that they've got access to that data in real time. And everyone said, well, you're crazy, because if they have access to lion data in real time, they're going to kill the lions. You're just giving them the opportunity to go and do that much more efficiently. And we said, well, we don't think so, because I think if you empower people and you trust people, they don't want to go and get into scuffles with lions necessarily, but we think this will be a better way forward. And sure enough, when you do this and you share the information, the lion killings really went down. Because people, I think, they felt empowered, they felt that they could act to remove their livestock, and it helped the relationship with the project, because it showed that you were actually treating people as partners, not as people who couldn't be trusted and couldn't be shared with information. We found when we looked at the data from attacks, about 67% of the attacks were happening in poorly constructed livestock enclosures. So we reinforced them with wire. This was meant to be the first step of a multi-step process. It's something we do on a cost-sharing basis between the household and us. It looks rubbish. If you went to a lion enclosure at a zoo and that was what was being used to keep them in or out, you would obviously leave and report them. But actually, it's super effective. So the data shows this is about 95% effective at preventing attacks. But obviously, it only protects it while they're in the enclosure. And what you don't want to do is just release the animals the next day to slightly hungrier carnivores waiting outside. So we're looking at how to protect grazing livestock as well. That's actually quite a bit harder. We talked to people about using dogs of various kinds. We'd use guarding dogs in Namibia, but people were really against the idea of using dogs until we had a village meeting where we were up at our camp and our 2 local little camp dogs were getting in the way of the meeting, and I told them to sit in Swahili, and miraculously they sat because they were terribly trained. And everyone, the whole meeting just ground to a halt. And I said, what's wrong? And they said, where did you get the magic dogs? And I said, what do you mean they're not magic? And they speak Swahili. And we said, well, actually, we normally speak to them in English. And they were like, they speak English? We need these dogs. And I was like, they're not magic, they're just normal dogs. We said that the guy who gave them the dogs happened to be in the meeting, so then actually, we got them from you. And he said, I would never have given you those dogs if I'd known they were magic. They're not magic. But then we became known as some crazy magic dog people, which enabled us actually to bring in real magic dogs. So these are specialist Anatolian Shepherd dogs, which look ridiculous. And that when you give them to a farmer, they're like, have you seen a lion? A lion, this looks like a canapé. But they actually grow up into be fairly big, scary dogs, actually a little bit too big. I talked about food insecurity and poverty, and it's actually an issue that if people can't feed their children, how can they feed their dogs? And we fed them for the first year until they became protective. But it's still a real ethical issue about how do you invest in dogs rather than children? Yeah, it's an ongoing issue to think about. We also work with mobile enclosures called bomas, and these tackle depredation because carnivores do not like flapping canvas. It shines in the moonlight, freaks them out. And also it actually turns out to be very important for food insecurity. And we worked with another Wild Crew project, TKPP, to learn from them. And this is their data. So this is where you've put the boma. So obviously the cattle, when you put them in it, they tread dung into the soil. So this is where you've had the boma, this is where you haven't. And unsurprisingly, the crops grow far better in the treated ones. This protects against depredation, and it significantly helps with food insecurity as well. We also have these things called coexistence co-ops, and this is where we try to bridge the gap between more sort of high-tech sort of approaches, geofences, etc., alerts, with very traditional approaches, and we have a lot of discussion about which works best for reducing conflict and how we can integrate the two. So we know we can reduce attacks, but the most important thing really is thinking about how do you deliver effective, meaningful benefits that are important for local people. There's also cultural issues about money and status, and this was a very important part when we got the warriors engaged. And they said to us, when we go out and kill a lion, it is the one way that we get cattle, we get to earn cattle, basically. So when they go out, the bravest warrior is the one who throws the spear that first hits the lion, and so this is the spear marks here. That warrior is the one that gets to go and cut off the right front paw, and he takes the central claw, he puts on amulets on his arm here, and he gets to go and show in the community what he's done, and they all give him gifts of cattle. And he said that's a way that you get to get married because you have cattle, and you get women to sleep with you as well. So it's the same thing that drives human behavior the world over: power and money and sex. Same thing there. So this was the way that they were using to get wealth and to get sex. There were also real myths about man-eating. So man-eating, unfortunately, is a big issue in southern Tanzania in particular. And this, though, interestingly, when people were attacked by lions, they didn't blame the lions. They said, in this case, these lions are being bewitched. They're actually spirit lions. And so they would say this is actually reflected intertribal conflict, because they were saying, you from a different tribe have bewitched that lion to come and attack me. And so what it was revealing was these underlying social tensions, because tribes had no sort of, there's a lot of history behind it, but there were no good ways where people could talk about the fact it happened to them as well as it happening to other tribes. There's a lot of suspicion and a real lack of conservation awareness about why you care about anything like carnivore conservation to begin with. So going deeper than the depredation, we had to tackle all these multiple different issues. So we sat with the communities and we talked to them about what would a good benefit initiative look like to them? How would they want to benefit from conservation? And so they came up with the sort of things you'd expect anyone to come up with: probably education, investment in healthcare, and in this case, veterinary medicine for pastoralism. So we currently support 16 schools with educational materials, everything from books, desks, all sorts of things to increase that. We've provided over 80 scholarships for enable children to go through secondary school. Half of those have gone to the girls. That's the only time we went against the communities, because they said they didn't want girls to get the scholarships. They said, there's no point educating women because they get pregnant, they get married, so we're just going to educate the boys. And I was like, I disagree with that. So I think it is important you educate women. And interestingly now, more than half every year of these applicants are girls. They're coming back through, and those girls tend to stay in the community when they're educated. They're coming back as pharmacy assistants, etc. And it's really changing the perceptions of values of girls and their education. And we're also supporting them to go through college. We found that when we were doing the scholarships, lots of children weren't reaching the right standard despite having the physical materials in schools. And they said, well, it's because they don't have food at school, so they come hungry, they don't eat at school, and therefore they can't concentrate. So we set up a porridge project. So you have fortified flour, milk, eggs, beans, things like that. So they have a nutritious meal. It's really increased school attendance and school attainment there. So we're feeding over 1,000 children every day. We've now delivered over 1 million school meals. And we're also enabling access to better medical care, because it's a real priority, particularly amongst the women, that we would focus on clinics and have a real focus on better neonatal and maternal health care. So these were big aspects of the work with the clinics, and enabling better access to veterinary care and medicines that were appropriate for that. So we were doing this, and this was all happening, and everyone would be happy and wave at us. For like 4 years, we invested a lot in these benefit programs, but people were still killing the carnivores. And why wouldn't you? You'd take the benefits, you'd still kill the carnivores. And at the same time, we were doing camera trapping for our ecological work, and the camera traps were getting stolen. And we were like, God, no, this just isn't quite going right. So we decided to come up with a different program where we really strongly link those benefits to the presence of wildlife. And I think this often doesn't happen with community, with conservation programs. So we decided, instead of us doing the camera trapping, we'd give the camera traps to the communities, and the amount of wildlife they camera trapped on their land would be strongly linked to the benefit systems. So it took months to come up with these systems, but basically the villagers had to decide with us how many points per individual animal. So something like a dik-dik was worth 1,000 points. A baboon or a primate was worth 1,500 points. It's per individual animal, so this was 2,500 points. We gave more points for more conflict-causing species. So a hyena was 10,000 points, a lion was 15,000, and we also gave more points for endangerment, so the top spot was 20,000 for a wild dog. As I said, it's per individual animal, so this spot, this thing of 17 wild dogs got the village 340,000 points. They were thrilled. This gets 0 points. This is the picture you get wherever you put young men, camera traps, and alcohol. We have 0 points also, in addition to the arse shots. You have 0 points for snared animals to try and reduce snaring, and we have extra points for highly traded animals like pangolins. And those points directly generate healthcare, education, and veterinary benefits. And that's directly, honestly, it's such a huge sea change. It's really directly increased tolerance for wildlife on village land. We're seeing people now having sort of lions, breeding groups of lions, being excited they can record them. They put the camera traps out there. This pangolin was caught on one of the villages we worked with. They brought it in, they wanted to sell it, and they said, no, hang on, we get loads of points for that camera trap, for that pangolin, you've got to take it back. Lots of discussions ensued, but this is the pangolin on its way back to freedom, to being released again. I swear they dragged it in front of the camera trap like 20 times, but then it disappeared into the bush. And this is now being scaled up internationally. Multiple countries are using it. It's been nominated for various awards, but it's a really good system, I think, of showing that wildlife can have different value. And we've really focused on engaging women in particular in conservation. So the women have had a strong role in what benefits matter. And they, interestingly, not long ago, we had a group of young men go out and try and go on a lion hunt in the national park. And the women called them back in, and they said, you are killing the very thing that is enabling us to give birth safely and educate our children. We're not having it. We're putting a ban on lion and elephant hunting in this village. And it caused a massive argument. And the warriors were like, we want to do it. The women were like, this is our house, our rules, you don't get to do it. And eventually the women won, and that has held to this day. But in terms of engaging the warriors, we talked to them about these cultural issues. How do you get money? We can get you money by employing you in conservation. So we have these young men going out and tracking lions and doing sort of the parabiologist role. And we were really digging down what it means to be a warrior for them. So they said it means because you kill a lion to prove warriorhood, but that means to be brave, to be the person that your community goes to when they need something. So they go and they respond to lion incidents, they chase lions away from households, etc. And so they get their money. But we said, how can you get the status that comes with spearing a lion? Because that is really quite hardcore. And they said, there is only one thing that would give you the status that comes with killing a lion, and that's learning to read or write, because no one can do that. And so there was only one guy in the village that we worked in when we started this that could read or write. And he said, everyone goes with the forms. He's the one that everyone turns to. So all these guys have now been taught to read or write. They're learning English. They travel every year internationally to Kenya. They are seen as the guys. And I remember these women coming up and saying, we used to want our daughters to marry lion killers, but now we want them to marry these lion defenders, these guys, because these are the guys going somewhere. So it's really changing the idea of that you can be a warrior and a defender in lots of different ways. With the man-eating, we had no idea how to deal with this until the World Cup came, and we realized that the one thing that brings young men together is football. And so we've started these intertribal football teams so that people can talk, and it's a very softly approach, but it's not just you having your lion attack. I've also had one, and they can talk about some of these issues in a way that crosses some of those tribal divisions. For improving conservation awareness, we take people to the national parks. All of these people live close to the parks, but very few go in because they don't have money. They don't have access to vehicles. And the number one thing we hear from people when they go into the park is, I didn't know lions could be gentle, or I didn't know elephants played with their babies. You know, it's a real change in how we often see wildlife compared to when you only see it if it's coming and attacking your livestock, your crops. We also do DVD nights in the villages where everyone comes from miles around to watch these films. We show wildlife films, and these are amazing, but they're almost all in English. And we have show them like The Last Lions from Nat Geo, Disney, all sorts. They're amazing footage. People love them, but the very clear message from these is that this is not your story. Even if you've got someone translating it in them, it's not made for you. These are not your stories about it. It's a real divisiveness. So I've bitched about that to Nat Geo and to Disney and to all sorts of people who fund us, and very little has happened. So we decided to then take a little bit of things into our own hands, and so we started writing children's storybooks. And these put, like in this case, the Barabeg at the heart of the story. We worked with them on the stories, getting everything right about, they really had a lot of detailed input on things like what they'll be wearing and the length of the spears and all these kinds of things, and tells these stories. And these are in Swahili and English, and they provided free to the schools and to all the local families. And these kids that don't have books. And so we've done 3 of these now, and it's really, really good to see. It's really hard to explain, but it's really beneficial when people sort of get that engagement. It's been turned into little cartoons locally with Barabeg voiceovers and things, so that they can feel that this is their story and they're at the heart of it. And a really important part of this is creating revenue streams from conservation, new revenue streams. We've got premium carbon credits called Lion Carbon, where it's an add-on to a normal carbon credit. This was done in the Zambian program, so that we're getting additional revenue that feeds back into people maintaining the lions as well as the carbon. And we're working a lot with Carnivore credits, with Yavinda and with Jonathan Bailey and others. We've got a big grant recently now to start to look at biodiversity credits and how you can bring in new substantial revenue streams that mean you're talking from just shifting at a real poverty sort of level into significant streams of revenue for maintaining these animals. We know this works in terms of the depredation. So we know the depredation has been reduced in the core area by over 60%, and the carnivore killing has been reduced by over 70%. A lot of what we focus on is building African conservation leadership. So this is a training that we did with a group of women, 30 women from 17 different countries, about this African Women's Conservation Leadership Program. And this kind of stuff is super important. And we were really able to build these programs that are working and to help build the leadership that's needed to give it sort of more longevity. But as I said, for the last sort of few minutes of this, I'll move into the sort of the broader outside perspective, because as I was moving between the field and particularly the UK, it was very, very obvious. I think conservation is one of those fields that's fascinating because the public are super involved. And what the public, the wider public, think has a huge impact on what conservation decisions are made. So for example, this was yesterday and today. I've been whining about this on my Twitter feed, anyone who's unfortunate enough to follow me on Twitter. So I was talking about this because it's the sort of thing that's just, to me, is baffling. So this is a lion in the heart of the Mara who apparently got a venomous snake bite. And so KWS dashed in there, darted him 3 times apparently, and then gave him anti-inflammatories, which I just don't think would work against a venomous snake bite anyway. And they say, thanks to the public reports, he's on the path to recovery, reunited with his bro. And so I was saying, is this what we want to be doing? You know, in a wild place with one of the densest lion populations in the world, why are we choosing to intervene in what is a very natural event? Anyway, it sparks off a lot of interesting discussions about when you should intervene and when you shouldn't. Oh my God, and there's endless people posting pictures about him and showing how the swelling's going down. And yeah, it's an interesting one. But the public have got a lot of sway in conservation because lots of the countries and the wildlife services are very worried about what the public think. And one of the biggest topics, because again, one of the things I've got most interested and engaged in discussing, again, my Twitter feed is 90% about this bloody topic now, but is the topic of trophy hunting. So one of those ones where it just seems to have captured the attention, particularly since the killing of Cecil the lion in 2015. It's a hugely contentious issue about people pushing to say that we should ban trophy hunting in particular. And the arguments against lion trophy hunting are very simple. Lions, obviously, I've touched on, they're threatened, they're declining. It's rich, usually white hunters who are adding to lion mortality by killing the genetically best. You'll see this a lot, large lions. Killing one male can obviously lead to many more deaths through infanticide. The funding from hunting is small, it doesn't reach local people, doesn't benefit conservation, and corruption is an issue. And people fundamentally just say it's just wrong and it should be stopped. So who can argue with that? But I'm a big fan of thinking that every problem is simple from a distance. And so we have been spending quite a bit of time, sort of the research that we're doing now, looking at the level of threat posed by this. And it's certainly true that poorly managed trophy hunting can have a negative impact at a population level, particularly for species like lions, which are infanticidal. But experts clearly agree that it's not a major threat at a range-wide level. So this is in East and Southern Africa, it came 6 out of 9. West and Central Africa, it came nowhere. Because it can also have a clear positive impact when it's well managed, even in corrupt countries, by maintaining wild habitat. And it's not a key threat. We've just done a big analysis of it to any species on the red list. It's cited as having a negative impact on populations, local populations of 9 species, positive for at least 20. And so I think as conservation scientists, we have to be led more by evidence than emotion. And ironically, it can have benefits as well, particularly with habitat loss and habitat protection. So in Africa, more land is maintained under trophy hunting than in national parks. This is in Tanzania, so the dark green is national parks. It needs to be updated because this is now a national park, this little bit. But basically, those are areas where you have, and these areas have trophy hunting in them. And if you look here at agricultural land conversion, the primary threat to wildlife, you would know that something is happening in these places that's helping protect against them. So even if it's not perfect, it's helping maintain habitat and therefore prey and non-hunted species. It's true that the funding's definitely not enough. It often doesn't reach local people, but the same is true for phototourism. So I think do we want to ban phototourism? Should we have that same discussion? And also people don't realise that many national parks are subsidised by the hunting areas. And we're seeing in southern Tanzania, the vacant blocks that are coming up now, we've got about 150,000 square kilometres of land in Tanzania, which are vacant hunting blocks because of import restrictions have come in. We're seeing forest losses accelerating there. We're seeing more poaching. There's real issues with the lack of management in these areas. So I think it's really important to maintain the land that we can. And the lack of hunting doesn't mean a lack of killing. This is just one of those things that people just don't think about. So as I talked about in Ruaha, the number of lions killed was about 50 to 100 times higher than if it was a hunting area. And it's far more in a teeny area that is exported annually by most African countries. Half the lions that we found killed were female, and they were often heavily pregnant and lactating, as I said, devastating impacts on the population, and no replacement, which you would have if it was a male takeover and they actually breeding more young lions. So it's far more damaging effects than trophy hunting, and it takes older lions after they should have bred, so those genes should have been passed on. So surely we should reduce any threat that we can, and that's true, but only true if it doesn't increase bigger threats. And there's a huge risk, I think, of stopping this without having a better alternative ready. And this is going to be one of my really technical graphs. So this is a general schematic of like threats to lions, so conflict with people, wild prey, habitat loss, trophy hunting sometimes, and really a lack of investment. Over 90% of protected areas with lions have insufficient investment. If you take away trophy hunting, ironically, you take away that small one, but you massively increase the habitat loss, the wild prey loss that comes with it, the conflict with people because there's not a buffer area then, there's less wild prey, fewer jobs, and you're reducing one of the big revenue streams for a lot of those areas. And that ultimately obviously will lead to fewer lions. And I think it's a significant issue. And what we're pushing for at a political base is having an alternative ready before anything is taken off the table. And people always say, well, why don't you just go to phototourism? If it's an easy solution, it's unfortunately unlikely to work in many hunting areas because there's often more unrest, more civil insecurity, disease, more remote, more unattractive. So the sorts of places, particularly around North and West and Central Africa, the hunting zones there are never going to be attractive in terms of phototourism. And even across Tanzania, 24 national parks, only 2 of them make money. And so the idea of sort of doubling that land and expecting tourism to maintain it is really unlikely. So what it's far more likely to do is to end up to conversion to non-wildlife-based land use like farming. And really, the sad state of affairs is at the moment we currently have few options, and we need to keep all the options we have until we have better ones coming through. And maybe things like biodiversity credits are something that could really be an additional significant revenue stream, and we can phase out some of this. But it's really important also to respect local decision-making and avoid the hypocrisy. We have extensive trophy hunting here in the UK, so demanding that it's banned elsewhere is important. And I think that leads to just wider questions about ethics, rights, and power. And I thought this was just an interesting advert. Ricky Gervais is against trophy hunting. You should be too. I was like, I'm not sure that when we saw the COVID briefings, I never saw Ricky Gervais up there being asked what he thought we should do. It was the medical scientists. But it's an interesting thing that in conservation, we tend to really focus on what actors and comedians think. And the voices tend to be stronger the further they are from the field, which is a huge issue if we want fair, inclusive decision-making. And then you have local people being vilified, they're corrupt, the comments you see on social media are awful about this. And they seem to be valued less than iconic wild animals. And I think that's really problematic from a conservation point of view. And those external policies can damage communities and wildlife. So how on earth do we develop more inclusive, more equitable conservation models where they have a proper voice? And misinformation, we were touching on this earlier, misinformation is a huge and growing problem, I think, in conservation. We did an analysis of the debates in the Houses of Commons about trophy hunting and looked at which, of all the checkable statements that MPs made on this topic, how true or untrue were they? 75% of them were false. And that's, I think, a real problem for our decision-making if you want evidence-based policy. And how do you communicate complexity and nuance in what is increasingly simplistic arenas, where people like a tagline, a simple story, simple villains? And how do we really effectively strengthen the voice, the rights, the power of local people in decision-making, particularly when they're up against powerful lobby groups? This is an issue with the Inuit, who use trophy hunting with polar bears. Again, sustainable, good for the communities, but something that is deeply vilified. And there's more questions than answers, but I think it's just that broader topic of how do we think about complexity, not just the ecological complexity, but that wider complexity in conservation as well. So just really, I think to bring it together, I think community conservation needs all of us. And when people think about community conservation, if they ever do, I think they think probably about things like this, you know, people meeting with local communities and talking about that. But we saw from the very beginning of this that the global community is invested in large carnivores, is invested in big cats. We all want wildlife there. And everyone from the lobby groups to the local people to the politicians, that's the community that we need to bring together to think about how do we have effective conservation, how do we have that informed, how is it equitable, and what decisions get to be made and who gets to make them. So I think it's just a microcosm of some of those bigger issues we need to think about. And we're happy to chat more over drinks. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy. Terrific seminar and amazing story as well. So it's really compelling to see that. We'll open up for questions. I'll just kick off with one. I think you hinted a bit with your introductory credits and things. How was that work funded, and what's the long-term sustainability? Does it require this constant sort of stream of external funding?
Definitely, and it's one of the biggest things we get, as you'll know, on grant applications. You always get that thing, how will this be sustainable after the life of the grant, the 3 years, whatever, and I always write in teeny font, like, this will, just to get it all in, you know, this isn't sustainable at the moment. Probably for the next 20 years, it isn't sustainable unless external people are willing to pay for conservation, because the people living alongside these animals are some of the poorest people in the world who will never choose or be able to choose investing in conservation above all the other pressures they've got. So if we as a global community want there to be lions and other species around, we're going to have to pay for it. So it may be that that grant ends, you look for another grant, but if we as a sort of a group of conservationists can't sell the need for this, I think that's part of our responsibility to do it, because we will need that funding to bridge that gap. You know, maybe in 20, 30 years, and I can see this potentially becoming more embedded, but ultimately through different ways, and we talked about the biodiversity credits, we've moved from pure philanthropy towards different sort of payment schemes, but ultimately looking at things like the biodiversity credit ideas. But those will need to be funded by the international community as well. Funding in biodiversity poor places to maintain biodiversity in those rich places. And I think that is going to be the way that it's going to be for a long time to come. I can't see it being sustainable internally for a long time.
Do you see things like credit mechanisms potentially replacing philanthropy, or there'll always be a need?
I think there'll always be a need for philanthropy, because the credits will only work probably in some places. So I think you'll probably need as many strings to the bow as we can get. I mean, the analysis we did of funding with lion protected areas in particular just showed the gap was staggering. Like 90% of the protected areas are severely underfunded. So the gap at the moment is probably at least $1 billion to $2 billion a year, which is nothing in terms of the global finance, you know, that's available for this stuff. So if the credits came in, they could theoretically bridge that gap. But I think in some places, and at least in the short term, I think philanthropy is needed, state aid is needed, all sorts of other things as well.
Questions?
Thanks, Amy. It was nice to see what's happening in the areas where you're working. I was wondering about like other areas where you guys aren't working. And I know, like in Southern Africa, EWT is working like across there, and like Zambezi Delta people. And I wondered if you could just speak into like collaboration with those organizations, and whether you guys like try and converge on like similar methods, or if they found that there's other things that work maybe. Because I know it's obviously also very, very context dependent, and it depends on the groups of people who are living in those areas.
Definitely. No, definitely. I mean, I think collaboration is absolutely central, and we got so fed up of everyone sitting in their own little bubbles, their own places. Yes, it's got to be locally context specific, but the way the conservation space is set up, I think, is set up directly so you're actually competitors. And so if there's grants out there, if I have a good idea, I'm still waiting for it, but if I have it, I'm not going to share it with you because that's my USP and I can go to National Geographic and I can get the funding for it. So that idea that collaboration is actually penalised in the grant system that we've got is deeply flawed. So a group of us who work on these sorts of things actually came together and created something we called the Pride Lion Conservation Alliance to have collective shared, and the only ethos was you share everything. So if I have an HR policy for my organisation and you need one, then I share it with you. And if you have a new crazy idea that is working there, I use it. So the whole idea of saying, how do we reduce the barriers to us doing our work and how do we more openly collaborate? So and that model led to things like the trainings and collaboration being a real ethos, saying how do we get all these people together and hear those different perspectives from South Africa and Nigeria and all sorts of places so that we can learn from each other. And then you can work out which, because you can't have a cookie cutter approach, but which are the sort of universal principles that you know if you go this way, you can go 60% of the way with the cookie, and then you need to do the real tailored approach depending on these other contexts. So I think collaboration is central. We're trying to move towards it. It's more of an uphill struggle than it should be. And we've talked a lot to funders to say to them, they've got a lot of the power here. If they fund collaborative grants, then that pushes people to collaborate because you need to have it to come from that driver. Otherwise, people doing it just for goodwill, if it costs you money and costs you grants, you're not going to end up doing it. So yeah, I think it's a hugely important part of it. And on the conservation payment stuff, there's been loads of interest in that community camera trapping and everything. So we've set up a coalition for conservation payments. It's an online community, anyone can join it. Even if you have no idea, you're never going to do it, you just want to learn about it, or you want to work in it with people who want to work in it with penguins, for instance, and then you're just sharing. It just builds these communities where you can share things openly. So I think it's really, really important.
It's for the online audience.
Yeah, now it's on now.
Super fun, Amy, as usual. Fascinating. The points of trust and complexity are two things I'm wrestling with massively. And one is bringing some of the lessons you're learning back to sort out the major problems that we have and that we're causing within this country. I do wonder from a university perspective, are we effective at educating about these complexity issues within a university setting? Are our undergraduates and others across the country coming out with this understanding that we are all interrelated? And I do worry that a lot of it comes out as we just come into that viewpoint of, I care about biodiversity, so everybody else is bad if you threaten that. And can we do more? Can we do better? Because your experience is clearly effective in that. And any advice, I guess?
No, definitely. I think it's a huge issue. Absolutely. Like, how do we? And there's lots of elements that how do we get complexity across, and where's the space for that? And that space is shrinking, unfortunately, because we live in a world, as we know, of tweets and sound bites, and it's really difficult. And I think that's something as science in general we're up against about how to do that. And part of that, I think, is good communication, that we have to be able to communicate complex ideas well and simply, but how to do that without dumbing it down too much is obviously a challenge. And I know you're working a bit on this, but thinking about so good communication, we can definitely do better. And I can't bear, my biggest bugbear is when I talk to people and I say, what's the sort of impact of your work? And they'll say, I'm going to write a paper. I'm like, that's not an impact. It's just, no one's going to read it. But you have to think about how to go beyond, and also how we join up. And this is something I know we've talked about, and even within Oxford, let alone beyond, how do we join up what we're doing more effectively, share ideas, communicate more as one, and saying, the kind of nature group at Oxford are doing all of these things, and we've got all these varying strengths. And then across universities, trying to build those, and it's huge. And then you go beyond the university sphere. You don't just want to be in our ivory towers talking to each other. How do we get people to listen to people from universities when there's a real and growing, I think, sort of not just a sort of a distrust of experts, that kind of whole, the age of the expert is over. And the echo chambers, it's a fascinating one. It's one of the things I'm really interested in, but I don't have the answer, but I think we can get better at it. But I think we have to have open discussions about those risks.
That was really interesting. Thank you very much. You mentioned the sort of camera trap point system, sort of improving tolerance.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you knew how, if such trials have been tried in countries where land use change has already happened, and whether that can also improve sort of tolerance with potentially problematic species or species that are conservation concern, and if you think they might actually be applicable landscapes where that land use change has already happened.
Definitely. So they actually, a lot of the thinking behind that came from Sweden, where there had been a lot of land use change. So they used a lot of payments for presents with things like wolverines, and when they would pay local sort of people, I think it was 25,000 Swiss francs, whatever, for having a wolverine den that had a litter, that actually sort of went to independence. And so that was where that sort of came from, and we adopted it more in an African context. So I think the discussion was more whether it can happen here in a place where the governance is really poor, and how you would deal with all those issues about transparency and elite capture and all those kinds of things. I think in places where land use change has occurred and where there are strong anthropogenic pressures, it can definitely happen and is somewhat more likely to happen because you've got other frameworks in place often that will make it better. So yeah, there are actually quite a few examples around the world of these things, but I don't think we use them nearly enough.
Hi, thank you. That was a very nice presentation. So I'm a marine scientist. This is not my field, but I work with Marion Pfeiffer, Professor Marion Pfeiffer in Newcastle. So I help her with their teaching. And one of the big questions to the students, or assignment questions, was always, I'm not sure if I understood correctly, question was always fencing or not fencing to mitigate or reduce human wildlife conflict. And I wonder if you have had experience in doing that at large scale, and whether you personally think it's a good thing or bad thing.
Yeah, so the whole fences, the dollars and fence paper came out. There was a big fuss between particularly some things around the lion protected areas, and I was on the anti-fencing paper, if you characterise it as the pro-fencing and the anti-fencing. I was going to hang on, there are loads of issues with fencing, they're expensive. I think they demarcate wildlife and non-wildlife places, which is very difficult. So you end up saying, if you fence your national park, fine, people aren't allowed in past the fence, but then wildlife often comes out. And that means you've got very clearly wildlife and non-wildlife space. I would prefer to see places with softer boundaries where possible, but like anything else, and they're expensive and they're difficult to maintain, and if you need to electrify them, they're hugely expensive, animals dig under them, there's loads of issues with fencing. But like anything else, I think it's a continuum where there is space and place for fencing, but it has to be in certain places. So I think if it's used judiciously, I would rather also probably see fencing around key human areas where needed, if livestock fields or whatever, than always fencing wildlife in, rather than fencing the other ways. You have smaller scale, sort of like we'd use fencing on a tiny level with the bomas. And so you're fencing the asset, but you're not excluding the wildlife from a broader perspective. So yeah, there's quite a bit written about it, but I think I would generally lean more towards the concerns about connectivity and everything else, and the perceptions around fencing.
So thank you very much. And it's amazingly complicated, and I thought you did a great job pointing that out. And you also clearly took some unpopular stands for a number of reasons. And I wondered about some of your last points, where you talked about involving the local community in decision making. And a lot of what seems to be driving progress is academics and local people in our countries, making decisions about the livelihoods of local people. How do you involve that, or how is progress being made involving?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of progress, probably over the last 10 years in particular. You've seen a lot more recognition of the roles, particularly of Indigenous peoples and local communities in biodiversity frameworks. I mean, at the beginning, it sort of went for more of that classic fortress conservation, and just people were never really given much thought, I don't think, apart from the fact that they were a threat. That seemed to be where, for a period it went through that. I think now, you're seeing it included a lot more in global frameworks, even things like the 30 by 30, which caused a lot of debate about whether, if we're having 30% protected, is it protected from whom, by whom, for whom? And then does that mean excluding people from 30%? It doesn't, because of course they've got the other effective conservation measures. So you've got, I think it's recognizing that people can be part of landscapes and need to be part of landscapes in many of these places. So again, looking for more of the ability to say, how do you make sure that these aren't decisions being made to people, but with people? And I went to the APAC Congress a couple of years ago now, which is the African Parks Congress in Rwanda, and it was amazing because it was so heavily African. It was so driven by the needs of people. It was great to see local people up there talking about their needs, that I think, I suddenly thought, God, you would never have seen this 10 years ago. It's just, so I think we're really making big strides in it. I think it can, again, be one of those things that becomes very polarizing, because it's not like indigenous people are the answer and everyone's like a halo, because, we see this with the Barabeg. The Barabeg are indigenous people, and we're killing lions left and right. So I think this idea that it becomes sort of angelic is also, you go too far to one way. You have to think people are people all across the world. In some cases, you need critical infrastructure, which I think can include some exclusion, some protected areas, just as you would say an airport's important for a country, maybe a national park's important. But you have to make sure you have the full process, and you have to make sure, all those proper inclusion of local people. And I just think the frameworks are there much more than they used to be, which is heartening, I think.
I just wondered if you knew, or if you could direct to studies that have looked at how much revenue is generated by trophy hunting, like what would a lion cost if I wanted to go and shoot it, for instance. Is that information out there?
It is out there. There's a place called bookyourhunt.com you could go. Look at it all over the place. So everywhere, and it would cost anything from sort of 3,000 to 5,000 if you wanted to go down to South Africa, and well, you can do that much less now, but sort of shoot some canned lion in an enclosure, up to about 75,000 if you wanted to come out to Tanzania and do a 21-day hunt. So very variable. Something we're doing at the moment is situation analysis that will hopefully lead into an IUCN policy brief, looking at sort of what do we know about this topic, how many countries is it done in, what species are affected, what's the threat. There's a huge amount, it's like 270 pages. So we've looked at the economics. There was a great paper from Parker et al. On Asia. They looked at, 13 different countries, potentially, I think it was 11 different countries. Anyway, they looked at Asian countries and looked at each one, what revenue was brought in, how it's dispersed, etc. The other place to go is the state of the wildlife economy. So there's a big report from the African Leadership University looking at all kinds of revenue streams, tourism, trophy hunting, game meat, loads of things. And so there's a big section in that on it as well. I have. Yes, he doesn't like me. Well, I've suggested, I suggested when I was on Good Morning Britain talking about this, and there was a PETA woman there arguing against me, and I said, look, that's great, I don't like it either, but if you don't, currently the hunters are paying for this land, why don't you pay? You raised, I think it was $80 million last year. Why don't you pay? And they were like, well, why should we pay? And so because you want to take away the revenue, you want to take away the model where other people are paying, so you pay. And they said, well, it's not up to us to pay. I was like, well, then someone's going to have to pay. So yeah, I think I keep pushing back on the idea of, someone needs to pay or these areas are going to be converted. So if it's not going to be the hunters, then why not be the anti-hunters? I think it'd be great to show a model where you could have, and I've strongly pushed for this, you have those areas for tender, where it doesn't have to be hunters who take them. It could be non-hunters or anti-hunters and pay the same amount of money and manage it without hunting. Like, great. It's not the hunting that's necessary, it's the revenue that's necessary. But unfortunately, if only the hunters are putting the revenue in, then that's where we are. Yeah.
I guess my last question is just like, do you have any sense of, I totally get your arguments through. Do you have any sense of what the warriors, sorry, I forget the name of them.
Yeah, the Barabeg, yeah.
You've been like investing all this time and energy in asking them, pleading with them to not kill lions. And suddenly it's okay for, these hunters, Western trophy hunters, to kill lions. Do you have any sense of how it makes them feel?
Yeah.
Whether they actually think, well, okay, we can get some of the kickback, it's fine, or whether they just feel really insulted.
No, definitely, it's a great point. It's one that comes up a lot in the Twitter debate, saying, hang on, how is it okay for white people to kill lions, but black people can't kill lions? But I often think it's a little bit like the shopping discussion. It's all right to go into a shop and take something if you pay for it. It's not all right to go into a shop and take something and walk out with it, regardless of who you are. There are just rules in any country about this. So it's not a black-white thing. It tends to be a revenue thing, who's rich and who's poor in that. In terms of the Barabeg, we've talked to them about this extensively, about the idea of people coming and paying to kill lions. And we've seen, because we're right on the edge of a trophy hunting area where the field camp is, and they will celebrate a lion that's been killed by Western hunters in the same way they would celebrate a lion being killed, because to them, they don't want lions, or they didn't want lions. Last year, for the first time, we had more than 50% in our surveys who say they did want lions there. So, but over a long period of time, it's a slow increase. But in general, killing a lion is seen as a good thing. And the warriors recognize that kind of desire to kill a lion. So it's not an alien concept at all. And I think they'd like to see more money from it. There's more antagonism that I've seen about, for instance, if they kill an elephant and the meat comes to the community, they don't want people to kill a smaller elephant. They want a bigger elephant. So I've seen tensions about them not killing big enough animals because they're not getting as much meat as they would want. There's a lot of, I think there are arguments, of course, about exclusion from protected areas, whether that's phototourism or hunting areas. Local people are not allowed to graze, and that's a big deal. If then you've got totally denuded land and you've got grasses in this area, you've got prey and you've got bushmeat. So that kind of thing, how do you get the benefits to local people? Do you have areas of access? Do you allow grazing rights? But I think that's about protected areas regardless of what they're used for, hunting or non-hunting tourism. So we have these discussions a lot with people. And I think it's one, and I think just another thing just to clarify on that is that we've never ever said to the Barrabegs, it's not our place, that you shouldn't kill lions. All we've said to people is there a way we could work with you to make it more sustainable? Some amount of lion killing is fine. You know, there's a reasonably big lion population in these places. And similarly with trophy hunting, some amount of lion killing is fine. But if you have an unsustainable amount of lion killing, for whatever reason, then I think as a conservationist, we need to tackle that and reduce it. So for me, it's not an ethical thing that lions can never be killed. It's that, is it a conservation threat?
I don't know if I missed it in your talk. How is the lion population doing in that landscape since your program interventions?
Well, we've only got 2 years of, we've got 2 independent sort of surveys, we've done sort of camera trapping surveys, so there was nothing done before. So we did the first one in sort of 2013, and we just repeated it. You know, we've done it 3 times now, so it's hard to tell. We don't have good enough data, there's too much noise in it at the moment, and there's loads of other things happening. So a big issue that's happening here is that the river's drying up. So there used to be a river that ran all the time, the major river that runs through it.